We will begin the webinar shortly. More people are still gathering, so we'll wait about another minute. All right, we'll get started. My name is Sharon Robertson. I'm the president and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to an important conversation that is part of the YWCA and Nashville, Middle Tennessee's webinar series. We started these monthly or bi-monthly sessions a few years ago. And the reason we felt it was important is we wanted to have these conversations to benefit our community. Because the one thing I do believe that we agree on is we want Nashville and Middle Tennessee to be the best community that it can be. And we believe these conversations help to further that mission. Not long ago, many of us gathered for our Stand Against Injustice community rally. We do this on an annual basis, where we reflected on the power of voting, honored the struggle of those who came before us. This year's rally's theme was Together We Rise, Advancing Justice Through Civic Engagement, and it marked the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We honored what was a grassroots movement that made it possible. This was a landmark piece of legislation, and it was designed to protect the voices of those who had been silenced or excluded from our democracy. Today's webinar is a continuation of that conversation. We want to take a closer look at the history and evolution of voting rights in the United States, the victories that have expanded access to the ballot box, and the ongoing, very strong challenges that threaten to restrict it. At the YWCA, we believe that civic engagement is a way that we can go about making change. And this change should lead to equity in our society. That is why we hold space for these discussions and invite a deeper dialogue, not to indict you, but to encourage learning, reflection, and action. And we truly believe that the more information individuals have, the more factual information, the better we all can be. Now, I'm excited because this is a stellar panel today. We have Mr. John Cusick, Dr. Sekou Franklin, and Ms. Rachael Spriggs. Now we'll start off. First of all, to set the stage. I spoke earlier about 60 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and we're still seeing new forms of voter suppression. From each of you, first of all, if you would introduce yourself briefly, but also touch on the different perspectives, history, law, grassroots, what you think is the biggest misconception people have about the state of voting rights today. I'll start with you, Mr. Cusick.
Sure, thank you so much, Sharon, and to the colleagues and everyone in attendance. My name is John Cusick. I'm an attorney at the Legal Defense Fund here in New York City and mostly work on voting rights and redistricting. And it's just such an honor to be here and be in conversation with you all today. I think I'd highlight about two or three things. And, the first misconception, though, for this particular audience is not going to come as any news is that racial voter suppression is not persistent. I still think that there are a lot of conversations happening where people don't think it's as persistent or that it has been mitigated over the years. And yet we are seeing and I know we'll talk about the Shelby County decision later, but just such a wave of voter suppression that is really a reaction to historic turnout by Black voters and other voters of color throughout the nation. Relatedly, is that the harms are not as great as they are. I think, unfortunately, people look to turnout as the metric for whether people are harmed or that there's not as much access to the ballot box. And that's just one, not the right metric, but also just not true of what's going on. And, I know that today's discussion, there will be a lot of places where, we're pointing out some losses or that the state of voting rights is, especially on the law side today, is um, not a lot of optimism in certain places, but there are victories and important victories happening throughout the country. For example, Louisiana's state House and state Senate map were recently ruled as violating the Voting Rights Act. There was a similar ruling in Mississippi for their judicial Supreme Court system. And even here in Tennessee, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Franklin and others in a lawsuit challenging the Fayette County Commission, where in response to that litigation, they remedied the map and produced a fairer map that did not have the racial harms that prompted the litigation. So hopefully at the beginning and at the end, we can try to think of places where there's good victories happening. And I'll turn it back to you.
All right, well, Dr. Franklin, give us a little history.
Greetings. Thanks for having me. Again, my name is Dr. Sekou Franklin. And thank you, Sharon and the YWCA for having me. I think that I would agree that some of the biggest misconceptions are that voter suppression, vote denial tactics are absent or minimal, but they are a central part of the voting process. So having robust voter protection infrastructures in place are instrumental to countering that, and they will be with us long after we die. I'm sorry. Also, the way voter suppression, vote denial, vote dilution operates is that you could shift elections and sway elections through surgical and targeted measures that impact small percentages of the vote, 2, 3, 4, 5%, but that can have a huge impact on the vote. And this is important to note because a lot of people think that that absent of Jim Crow, absent of wholesale voter suppression, vote dilution, then voter suppression and vote dilution doesn't exist. But the way it operates in the 21st century is, can you shift the vote at the margins through surgical, targeted voter suppression tactics? And it's often done through what some may call face-neutral procedures and tactics that have an adverse impact on the vote, and those persons that are those entities that are implementing those tactics and procedures often hide behind the face neutrality of it, even though they know that they're impacting minority voters, so to speak. And then the last thing I'll say is that we should think about voting rights and countering voter suppression through intersectional terms. So voting rights intersects with criminal histories, people that have histories in the criminal justice system. Voting rights intersects with communities that are impacted by foreclosure, gentrification, displacement. Those communities that experience that are more prone to having troubles with their votes being counted, their votes being fully exercised. Those communities that are impacted by disasters, the flood of 2020 in Nashville, Hurricane Katrina, the Albany flood in the early 1990s, and we go on and on and on. Those are communities that have that experience vulnerabilities of the voting booth. So developing kind of a large apparatus around voting rights, voter protection means that we also have to look at it through intersectional terms and have safeguards and guardrails in place and do upstream planning when it comes to those issues.
Thank you. And let's talk about our grassroots effort. Ms. Spriggs.
So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Rachael Spriggs. I'm the director of Powerbuilding for the Equity Alliance and the Equity Alliance Fund. We are the largest Black-led, women-led, multi-entity statewide organization in Tennessee. And so a lot of our work is centered around, of course, civic engagement, leadership development, grassroots organizing, issue advocacy, some of our pillars that we are using to create a more inclusive, informed, and stronger democracy. And so just to get to at the bare minimum, the answer to your question around misconceptions when it comes to voting, it is for us and what we see often at the doors and when we are in conversations is that our base are beginning to believe that their vote does not matter, like their voice does not matter. And so, in many of the conversations we have to kind of go to, I move them to where Dr. Franklin, some of the things that Dr. Franklin was just kind of discussing. If your vote and your voice didn't matter, then we wouldn't need so much voter protection. We wouldn't need, just look at all of the suppression that is happening around your voice. I'm currently, before the call started, I'm in Memphis and I'm looking at how strategic it is that they are now deploying the National Guards. And I think that also is a form in many ways of suppression right before different elections are getting ready to take place. But I think that when we think about, our base voice not mattering, we have to think about how we have fought against redistricting maps and how we have to fight against we're in several fights, how in 2018, we literally had to we mobilized over 91,000 people. We registered over 91,000 people to vote, and continuing those efforts because we are in a space where we are connecting their issues to the ballot box and saying, hey, and getting them to see and believe from tangible wins that we have prior to elections, that listen, you see how showing up is actually and using your voice, how that actually is impacting your outcomes. And so I think that that's one of the biggest misconceptions, that voting doesn't matter. Your voice won't be heard, but looking at it and seeing it in a collective, seeing the collectiveness, the power in a collective vote. So
One thing I will say is that, go ahead.
No, I said I yield.
Okay, being a lawyer, one of the things I've always found out throughout my years of practicing law was that if you know all the facts, things make a lot more sense. And this is those cases, you have to wonder if the vote doesn't matter, why there's so many efforts to suppress it. You don't put this much money and effort and time and strategy for something that doesn't matter. So people need to really understand that. So what you said is very, very important. I'll go back to you, Dr. Franklin, because this issue is very, very important. The history of voting, as I've told everyone, when my mother was first, she got out of a small HBCU, graduated Arkansas Baptist in Little Rock, Arkansas. Then she went and got a master's degree at Bishop College in Marshall, Texas. And one of the things in her first teaching job, she wanted to vote because she had grown up in a family, and that was viewed as just stellar. That was viewed as something phenomenal that you got to vote. So she ended up in a small town in Arkansas, Augusta. And when she first went to vote, they said because she had never had a family member and her people didn't vote, that she would have to pay a fee. I think it was a nickel, but back then a nickel was not just something people just threw away but by being a teacher and being single, she had more resources than the average person. But she wondered for a long time because she didn't know what a poll tax was. She didn't know that till many years later, that that's what she had to pay. But she paid, but so many people would not have paid. But see, elections are local, state, and federal. And so many people could not have voted because they didn't have the money or chose not to spend their money in that way. But that's a real life example of my mother having to go this extra distance, that individuals who were not Black in America did not have to do this because they had said there had been others that had come and relocated to that city that did not have to pay. And so it was blatant back then, but there was a reason that the laws changed to really outlaw this. And like I said, once you knew all the facts, you might have wondered, why are people fighting poll taxes? But this is the reason. That's some of the facts. If you knew those facts, you would understand them. So Dr. Franklin, looking back at things such as poll tax, literacy tests, historic barriers, what parallels do you see in today's voting restrictions?
Well, there are important parallels, and Ms. Spriggs pointed out a couple of them that are important. The main one of them was that we often do ignore is political violence and predicates for political violence, including what's going on right now in American cities. And so in the 1800s, especially on up to the 1960s, political violence was a fundamental tactic used by people involved in voter suppression. I'm going through affidavits right now of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, in which people are noting that. And one of the most important court cases to come out of the 1800s was the Cusick case that was really a mass slaughter of African Americans who were trying to vote in Indiana, that the Supreme Court actually allowed, more or less, chose not to move forward with an indictment. But we also have some other examples. We have photo ID laws that were implemented 15 years ago. I think there's been some adjustment to that, but when they were first implemented in places like Alabama, where there was not a government issuing office nearby, people had to travel and spend money. People raised questions about, does that equate to a poll tax? We have a problem with purging, as some of you know. The recent reports that came out of Tennessee in the last week showed that we have mass purging going on. The purging was a major issue, especially after the Shelby County Beholder case, in which at least one point, at least me as a voter actually were purged in the South. Some of them were purged for being classified as quote unquote infrequent voters. We have registration requirements that are being imposed, including here in Tennessee. Our legislature passed a law that created penalties for people for groups that are engaging in voter registration. Fortunately, we fought that off in the courts. We see voter, as Ms. Spriggs says, voter misinformation and disinformation is a voter suppression tactic. And the voter suppression, the vote and misinformation is really targeting African American voters. Again, with the message very strategically targeted that the vote doesn't matter. This is particularly used in 2016 and probably suppressed African American vote by 2 or 3 percentage points. And if I can go on and on and on, but also talk about redistricting. Redistricting is a long-standing tactic that is bad redistricting, racist redistricting practices. The most important case in the 1950s was a case out of Tuskegee that the Department of Justice took on as one of its first major cases as part of the Civil Rights Division. And Martin Luther King Jr. went to Tuskegee to support that fight in the late 1950s. And so we see today that redistricting, racist redistricting practices are being used to undermine the vote in Nashville, in Charleston, South Carolina, now in Texas, Kansas City, and other places like that. So we can go on and on and on about this, but that gives you a summary of what the past and the present, how those are linked together.
All right, Mr. Cusick, and I know that being an attorney, I'm biased, but I've always thought that if you have a mess, the only way to get out of it is through the legal process. I mean, it's a long game, but I do understand, and I do think that there's a lot of relief, and I really appreciate the work the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is doing. But Shelby County v. Holder dramatically changed the landscape of voting protections. From your work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, what has been the most profound consequence of that ruling for voters on the ground?
Yeah, it was a very difficult ruling, taking a step back, especially, in the honor of the 60th anniversary. I mean, the Voting Rights Act was the crown jewel of the civil rights legislation, banning racial discrimination nationwide and really giving some teeth to the 15th Amendment that had not been enforced to fulfill the true promise of equal rights. Under that, there was a section 5 for pre-clearance, where certain jurisdictions with a history of voting discrimination or racial disparities, they were required to seek approval either from the Department of Justice or from a U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., before making any voting changes to ensure that there wouldn't be any retrogression, meaning basically that what law whether it was a polling place, a map that was going to be passed, new photo identification law, that it would not have a retrogressive effect on certain groups of voters, including Black voters and other voters of color. It was a huge success. I mean, anywhere from thousands of proposed maps changes were blocked as a result of this. It's difficult to think in this climate that in 2006, the US Senate passed and reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. That was the latest one before the Shelby County decision, and it was 96-0. Not a single US senator voted against that bill. And so this huge effect, and it really ensured that the jurisdictions had to justify the change. I think too often what we see are these bad laws now that have been passed, lawsuits come in, to your point, and then you have all of this uncertainty going on. And so it really was a discriminatory checkpoint. The Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision comes in and essentially says that one of the coverage formula models for determining which jurisdictions would be covered was unconstitutional. And there's a famous line from Justice Ginsburg, who said it's like throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And unfortunately, after Shelby County, that rainstorm really turned into a hurricane. As one example, you had the state of Texas within hours of the decision pass one of the most at the time retrogressive voter identification laws. To Dr. Franklin's point, you see these voter purges happening throughout the country. And they're also impacting, and I think, the Brennan Center had a study where they said at least 31 states have passed 115 laws that make it harder for people to vote. And we've seen racial disparities increasing for turnout, who's registering to vote. And so they've had these profound effects. And especially in this redistricting cycle, which has been particularly problematic, many of the states, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, would have had to seek that pre-clearance. And so what has happened is that they've passed laws where federal courts have had to try to strike down many of these options and these bad maps. And so it really has forced so many community members to essentially step in the shoes as this private enforcement agency. And, the civil rights community and racial justice organizations really trying to step up and fill these gaps because it's been an onslaught. I think to the initial framing of this conversation, just to re-up, there's so much power going on. And I think all of these efforts are a direct response to try to suppress the vote, to make it harder to vote. And so it's had a very difficult one. I know we'll talk a little bit about ways that we're hopefully at some point Congress will create fixes for this, but has really had a pronounced impact.
Yes. And Ms. Spriggs, Tennessee has been a testing ground for restrictive policies. We have strict voter ID requirements, aggressive voter rolls purged. Today in the newspaper is talking about roughly 80,000 Davidson County in one county voters purged. They are trying to say many of these were inactive, but if you are registered to vote, you're registered to vote. From your vantage point, how do these local policies reflect national trends, and what unique challenges do we have right here in Tennessee?
Yeah, I think that we have, like, from the Equity Alliance standpoint, we're always looking at what does it mean for us to truly be a power, and just across the state, and when we think about what it truly means to be a power and to address some of the things that you just mentioned, from a local level. So from whether we're in Davidson County, for me, who's always looking at it, looking at from Davidson County, from Montgomery County, whether we're in Rutherford, whether we're in Shelby County, we're always thinking about and addressing our change theory when it comes to building power. And it takes true, consistent investment in leadership of people that are being directly impacted by a lot of these inequities that you mentioned. It takes grassroots mobilization, just year round. We notice that a lot of times organizations want to engage voters, you know, closer to the election. One of our sayings is we don't do one night stands. And we believe in coding our base all year long from our faithful voters programming that we do with churches and clergy leaders, from our shut up and vote tours that we do across the city, as which are happy hours. We literally believe in building equity from the trap house to the White House. We say that so often because it's about meeting communities where they are. It's about listening first. It's about equipping our base with the tools to organize and advocate for themselves year round. And so I think that one of the things we're seeing in Tennessee when it comes to who we are and how we show up with this work is we are big on relationship building with bold, visible campaigns. And so a lot of times that leaves us, we had like literally 1.1 direct voter contacts last year across the state. And I think that is commendable, because we believe in knocking on those doors and making calls in neighborhoods that are often ignored by traditional politics. We believe in training and supporting local leaders that can move the community advocates to believing that they have a voice and becoming decision makers. We believe in connecting issues, like I said earlier, to the ballot box and showing how policies on housing. Right now, we 3 months ago, we launched our Powering Economic Justice campaign, and we're connecting issues that we're hearing at the door to the ballot boxes by showing how policies on housing, healthcare, and education are directly tied to those who hold power, and seeing our base and allowing our base to see themselves as decision makers in that process as it pertains to who's in those seats. And so those are some of the things that those are some of the ways that we just continue to be a power and to define what that needs to look like in our communities as we do this work.
Thank you. And what you're really bringing up, which is so important, and we've stressed this on some other of our webinars, politics is local at the start. Everyone needs to understand there's that local presence, and you can move up the chain and you could be disturbed at what happens at the different levels, but politics is local, and people need to really understand how they effectively change or enhance the politics at the local level. All right, Dr. Franklin, we have young voters that are part of the movement going forward. You have a tie back to one of the greatest leaders this country has ever seen, Mr. John Lewis, as Executive Director of the John Lewis Center for Social Justice. We all are in agreement with that. How can we better connect this history, the strong history of the civil rights movement, to the challenges young voters face today, so that history really becomes a tool for the mobilization rather than just a memory? We need for them to understand that leaders didn't fight for things, did not die for things, that this is something that they can draw on to give them strength in what is really the next phase of the civil rights movement, the next level of the civil rights movement.
Well, that's a challenging question, because some of the groups that are young people's led, they want the history, but they don't want to be guilted into voting through nostalgia and history. So they want the history, but what they're telling folks is that in order to mobilize voters, they need something more than just vote because your ancestors died. And so I think the way to address that issue is to bring the history into the organizing frameworks, especially those organizing and voter mobilization trainings that are young people's led, to integrate the history into that process, and then to link that history to more contemporary voter mobilization strategies. There's some really good groups out there doing great work. Prairie View A&M just established the HBC Voting Rights Lab, led by Melanie Price. The Children's Defense Fund has the Black Student Leadership Network that will be meeting Friday and Saturday. During the election of 2020, Clark Atlanta University put together an election protection system. Howard University put together something similarly. in years past. The Students Learn to Vote Coalition. So these really good organizations that have really good ways of both integrating the history to more modern day voter mobilization tactics. Other ideas might be, again, we need more intergenerational conversations. Older folks do bring a reputational resource and experience that I think is valuable that are valuable to young people. We need many young people don't know that their grandparents, we'll say grandparents, their grandparents could not vote in some cases or faced severe restrictions from the voting, including intimidation. And those oral histories, those intergenerational dialogues in which history is conveyed are very important. Young people at the same time in these intergenerational dialogues could also introduce older voters to new voter mobilization tactics. And one of the biggest myths that I think is around is that older folks don't want to know or learn from younger people. And most of and I've done research on this for 20 years, but in most of the conversations I've had with older folks, there could be some adultism, quote unquote, that may come out, but there also is some ways in which they want learning. Young people can show older folks. Older folks can bring the history, and young people can bring the voter mobilization tactics that are new. How joy, how music, how poetry, how gaming. Now people are looking at gamers, how those kind of instruments can be used to help mobilize votes. There's the Black Male Voter Project with Mondale Robinson that knocked on 100,000 doors in the 2020 election, mostly in Georgia. And all this is necessary to create what some may call a habit-forming behavior. And habit-forming behavior basically is behavior in which we vote because it's our habit. It's like brushing teeth. So that means then, that means then that when we go to vote, we do so as a family. We bring our kids to the voting booth, right? The kids go to the voting booth with their grandmothers, and we want to instill it in our DNA. So those are some ways in which I think we can integrate history into with young people. But it's a to use a fancy term, it's a dialectic. It's not just older folks imposing history among young people, but young people are introducing older folks new voter mobilization strategies and tactics.
It's interesting what you said about they just don't want to vote just because of the history. Where, I've been brought up in a country where everyone said that you need to do certain things and be patriotic because people died for you to be able to have these freedoms. So it's sort of strange. I guess because I am old, I appreciate that history and I appreciate the struggle. But for that struggle, and some people forgotten what that struggle was like. And it's a hard struggle. It's a physical struggle for many, and it was quite a sacrifice. And I think that that's one of the reasons it's important for, I think, the younger generations to appreciate that. But I frankly think maybe it is worth it just because someone struggled for you to have this right that everyone didn't have. I appreciate all of that, but I can appreciate also that they may need more than that. So
yeah,
I'll go to you, Ms. Go ahead.
No, that's
No.
why intergenerational dialogues and family oral histories and community oral histories are important to have those lessons learned in a more genuine fashion. So I agree.
Yeah, and I do think it's important because I had these conversations with my mother. She passed a few years ago at 91. My father's 95, and he is still with me. But to really hear what life was like, you'll really appreciate the things that occurred and what they really had to do to even survive when you could not just go and sit down at a lunch counter and eat. You can't just walk in and assume that you can be served. And I think that those are really things that, having those conversations, it meant the world to me to have those conversations with my own parents. But I think the more younger people interface with, I'm talking about the old, no, I shouldn't say old, but those like 80s and 90s and that generation of elderly people. If you sit down with one of them and talk to them what it was really like when they were younger, it'll be an eye-opening experience. You'll go cast that vote if you see what they had to live with. All right, Mr. Cusick. Law and the movement synergy. Litigation is a strategy, which I understand. I always say that's the long game. I always say when I practice law, once you got into litigation, it was either over fast or over a long, long way. It's either fast or slow. But how do you see the relationship between courtroom victories and grassroots movements in creating lasting change for voting rights?
That's, and especially today, such an important question. I often think of a similar framing that if we're in litigation, it means that we weren't successful in blocking beforehand or trying to get the change through that. So, I think especially at the Legal Defense Fund and with so many of the civil rights and other organizations we work with, they go hand in hand. We are oftentimes doing everything we can in coalition through grassroots work to try to build up, to Dr. Franklin's point, issues about education, having these conversations for people to be mobilized. I think we are very cognizant that litigation is just one tool and that some of the most lasting changes are really these strategic interventions around non-litigation. So we have one component of LDS work called Be Voter, which is Black Voters on the Rise, where we do year-long campaigns working in jurisdictions, know your rights trainings, voter registration, mobile engagement, all of those different things to recognize that. I think, it's also just true that too often what happens is that a lot of groups, especially focused on voting, only show up in the midterms or at presidential elections. There's not a lot of the same work that needs to be done on off-year cycles or on the local level. And I think that is such a critical aspect of what needs to happen year-round. Leave no power on the table. And, I think the last point, and, this was in the initial framing, is, whatever victories you might get, if people are not excited and energized and there's not this sustained movement around grassroots organizing and those campaigns, that it's very difficult to do that. And I think some of our most strategic interventions, for example, in Georgia, just as one, ahead of the 2021 elections, there was this wave of 360,000 voter challenges that were submitted right before a runoff election. Unfortunately, I don't think litigation would have stopped that in time, nor the confusion, but what did is working hand in hand where you had folks showing up at each of the 159 county election boards in Georgia, working through, sharing information, having these demonstrations. And so I think, especially in this climate too, where, there are a lot of losses in federal court. I know certain state courts are equally as hospitable to certain civil rights and racial discrimination claims, that all of this is really going to happen long-term on policy and organizing. And hopefully, and I know we'll talk at the end of this, we at LDF are trying to work with groups to have state voting rights act and we've had success in New York, Connecticut, Maryland. Are trying to look at other places, but this is another one where you can be doing all of this long work. You don't have to wait for the federal government to try to do it as much as you can.
Yeah, let's bring it home to local. All right, Ms. Spriggs, the Equity Alliance is rooted in grassroots mobilization. This is what you do. This is your sweet spot. What does it take to truly build power at the local level? And what strategies have been most effective in Tennessee? And I always tell other people when I talk to my counterparts in places like Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, New York, and I said, if you can get it done in Tennessee, you can get it done any place in this country. I truly believe that. So tell us what's been effective. What strategies are used to mobilize individuals in Tennessee?
I think that what you'll see in Tennessee that is extremely impactful is the coalition building around different efforts. Cusick was talking about just the litigation from the litigation standpoint, but right now we are quickly and as proactively as possible, creating a campaign around the work that needs to happen with the National Guards, for example, that's coming in Memphis. But we're always on a call with all partners from across the Tennessee, everyone at the table. We're trying to figure out what legal supports do you need, what comm support do you need in order to, because it's important. When you're doing grassroots work, it's important for us to shape our own narratives. It's very important for us to have that calm support coming across the state, to have a statewide push versus, yeah, we working locally, but and they're always allowing those who are in those local spaces to determine, you know, how we're moving, but and where it is that they need to push and support. But we have that coalition, that coalition power in those teams, from legal, from comms, from training, where we need to quickly figure out what de-escalation needs to look like, who will probably most, you know, quickly be targeted in this specific work, because we're not only protecting for us Black voters, but communities of color at large. And so I think that single-handedly, the coalition piece, the Emerge pipeline, I think really thinking about how we develop leaders from within our own communities, because when we did the Black print, something that really, even to this day, is shocking, was shocking from that data, is that Tennesseans, they trust the police more than they trust politicians. From that survey, from those surveys that we did after surveying over 20,000 Tennesseans, that lets me know that there is distrust. There's a lot of distrust when it comes to politicians. There's a lot of distrust when it comes to voting, and like I stated at first, feeling like your vote count. And so that we've been from coalition spaces, we've been doing a lot to build co-governance models where the community and those who we're putting in office are working closely together. We're trying to make sure that people that looks just like us, that are on the ground with us, are being promoted to positions of power, and understand the need to stay in sync with the people that are on the ground. And so I think that those are some of the things that we are doing really well in Tennessee, and that is allowing us to kind of move the needle. But I would say single-handedly, anytime we are faced with anything from the ICE situation to school takeovers, we immediately come together in our coalition spaces.
Yes. All right. This is a question each panelist I would like for you to respond to. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act has been called a promise for restoring protections. It is really a fundamental piece of legislation that really should be, for lack of a better way of putting it, a no-brainer for anyone to vote for that believes in democracy. However, there's a lot of pushback. What do you believe it would take politically, legally, and socially for that promise to become reality? I'll start with you, Dr. Franklin.
Well, I don't have any magic answer, honestly. It's going to take mass mobilization. I'm imaginative to think that something even like a boycott by Power 5 athletes, Power 4 football player athletes is important, which I think in the last John Lewis Voting Rights Act, most people don't know this, but I believe the Alabama football coach wrote a letter to the senator from West Virginia, asking him to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because at the time there's mass mobilization in the streets after the George Floyd situation. So that shows you the power of sports, mass mobilization, capturing control of Congress, and it's going to have to be probably a supermajority of the Senate, because that's the only way that can probably get past the filibuster, unless Democrats find the courage to get past it, to do it on their own without a filibuster. And having also the right legal strategy is important, because one of the things that happened, if I could just take 30 seconds or so, when the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2006, although it was near unanimous support in both chambers of Congress, George W. Bush pushed it through a year earlier, before the expiration, because he didn't want to deal with it in the midterm elections. So he wanted to get it off the table. But what conservatives did, because they wanted to get off the table for the midterm elections, was, although they voted yes for the reauthorization of the VRA, they voted no in the legislative intent and legislative record. So if you go look at the Voting Rights Act throughout the entire legislative record, Republicans are pushing for mid-decade redistricting. Republicans are pushing for this voter suppression taxes. The conservatives are pushing for this and this and that. So the Voting Rights Act was passed. The battle was won, but the war was lost. And the war that was lost was that when the Supreme Court came after 2006, what the Supreme Court did from midterm, mid-decade redistricting all the way up to Shelby, but the Supreme Court struck to all crossover, opportunity districts, all this stuff. What the Supreme Court did was they began to strike down both sections 4 and also section 2 by going back to the legislative record that people who actually voted for the bill was a yay, but voted no in the legislative record and legislative intent. So those Supreme Court rulings that came out of the post-2006 reauthorization reflected a legislative record and intent of racial conservatives who voted yes just for political expediency, but knew that they were giving the Supreme Court a green light to vote no when it came to deliberations. So having a right legal strategy is extraordinarily important when it comes to a reauthorization bill.
And it seems as though it should be a long term. You can't go with just initial wins. You have to keep and be very vigilant. So that's very important. All right, Mr. Cusick, respond to that. What do you believe it would take politically, legally, or socially for us to move this John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act forward?
Yeah, I'll take it in reverse order. I think socially it will require folks continuing to turn out, to register, make sure they're voting, talk through education off year cycles, because I think that momentum then socially hopefully will change politically to the composition. I think, it is unfortunate it's a stalemate right now, and even under the previous Congress when there was a, different administration, it still stalled attempts for this act to pass. But politically, it will take some courage. I think it's worth uplifting again that in 2006, there was such, 96-0 was the Senate vote for reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act. And, on another part of that, and then the final one is the legal aspect is, there unfortunately will be no doubts, as there are right now, where there are attempts to even curtail other parts of the Voting Rights Act of whether private individuals can even bring litigation, that it will take legally, fair processes in courts to make sure that whatever passes is continued and upheld. And I think that's why it's so important. All of the activism and work going on could be part of a record that goes up and is evidence, of why Tennessee should be part of any new pre-clearance regime that should be happening too. And so I know that, as we talk about here at the Legal Defense Fund and think through everything that's going on, whether it's testimony at city council, your county commissions, school boards, the state legislature, all of these examples of statements made, racial appeals can all be part of this record that goes up hopefully at some point where Congress will vote and do the right thing. So that's just another, call to arms, if you will, of turning out, keeping track of these issues and trying to build a record while we wait to hopefully there is some courage in Congress to do the right thing.
All right, Ms. Spriggs, same question. What can we do to move this? What really it should be I guess I call it no brainer, but how can we move this promise forward?
Yeah, I think, yes, echoing a lot of what has already been said, but I think that in addition, just really understanding federal political strategy when it comes to this bill. We need enough votes in both chambers of Congress. We know that. We know that 1/3 of Congress is in the Southeast. Just really understanding what it means to break through partisan gridlocks in the Senate, where voting right bills have repeatedly been blocked by the filibuster. And so building bipartisan support, hard, it's very hard, will be hard, but it's definitely possible if pressure is high in states where suppression directly affects both parties. I think that then we go on over to grassroots mobilization as another strategy. We've been constantly talking about this, and that is my field house, and so lawmakers have to be able to move when the public demands it. And so that means simply organizing pressure campaigns, calls, visits, town halls, protests to make voting rights impossible to ignore. Highlighting stories from the community. Storytelling is so big. We have to, and I say this over and over again, we have to control our own narrative when it comes to the bills that we won't pass. So highlighting stories from communities harmed by voter suppression can put a human face on the issue. And so I won't reiterate anymore around the importance of coalition building, because that is extremely important for you to be on the same page with other organizations. But success will depend on Black-led organizations like the Equity Alliance joining forces with labor, faith communities, immigrant rights groups, disability rights advocates, and youth, rural organizers. And so the John Lewis Act, it just becomes more stronger when it's framed not just a Black issue, but as an American democracy issue that affects all of us.
Yes, very powerful. All right. Today, believe it or not, is National Voter Registration Day. And for people that may feel overwhelmed, that's the question that I get so much of. They're saying, well, what keeps the YW going? How do you keep moving forward? Because they just feel like they're just paralyzed because there's so much, I guess, injustices that's bombarding our society. And they're saying that it can make you just check out. So for those of us or those who may feel overwhelmed by the scale of the challenges, what are some concrete steps that they may take today to protect and expand voting rights in their own community? Because one thing we like to leave our audience with is hope. And I'm a very hopeful person. I don't know if it's in my DNA because my parents are very hopeful. All the struggles that they had to go through gives you some of that in your DNA. But with that said, what can we tell individuals that they can do? Concrete steps or something they could do if they feel overwhelmed by what they see as the lack of power in our society. And I'll start with you, Ms. Spriggs, because you're at that grassroots level and you look face to face with individuals who feel as though, what difference does it make? No one cares about us. No one's worried about us. We can't do anything. They have all the power.
We just immediately encourage them to be participants in democracy, in fighting for democracy. We give them very tangible ways to connect with not just us, but other partner organizations, depending on what it is that they care about. I think that is extremely important to connect individual issues to organizations, and because you'll see when people have buy-in around what it is they're fighting for, they tend to show up. It's easier to organize and mobilize those individuals. And so, like I said, we're building equity from the trap house to the White House. So that means being willing to go and to be, and we know Black people are not a monolith. So that means, like I said, over and over again, going into the churches, going into the clubs, going wherever we need to go. And so when we go into those places, we find different individuals with different issues, with different concerns. We know that voting is not the only tool. And so before we try to encourage people that are not encouraged necessarily to vote, we care about the issues and plugging them into finding tangible solutions to whatever it is that they do care about, and then showing them the connection to showing them the connection that issue have to the ballot box, like I continue to say.
Yes, that's very important. Mr. Cusick, one thing you said, and I actually wrote this down, leave no power on the table. That was so profound for me. I had to write that down because one of the things that the YW does here in the Nashville community, we provide more domestic violence services than anyone in the state. And domestic violence is about power and control. And so we always talk to our clients, the people that we serve, about taking your power back. And there are so many parallels in all these other relationships. So I always look at this as we need to take our power back. If you want the country to change from the perspective of justice, you have to take your power back. So can you respond to our question? What can we tell individuals?
Yes, and I think, the first is, it's unfortunate, but, given today and it's National Voter Registration Day, is that make sure to check that your voter registration is active. Unfortunately, to Dr. Franklin's point, what we see happening too often is that there's this, if you don't use it, you lose it, in certain states, or there are these attempts where illegally voters are being removed from the voter registration rolls. So that's first and foremost. And then to the point here about leaving no power on the table, I think it means showing up at your school boards, your county councils, your city councils. It doesn't need to be in this context of big statewide litigation or bills. It's being there as someone who's watching what's going on. I think, what we saw, especially in Fayette County with the county commission there, is not having anyone having eyes on what's going on these meetings, bills that are being considered. That's such an important role. And especially with everything going on right now, it's really important. And then the second is just to encourage that you can play a role. You could submit public records requests if there's information that folks want, maybe about certain things that are happening on the local level. You could participate. I think some of the actually most important work is being a poll volunteer or a poll worker, making sure that the election is running smoothly is so critically huge, because it's also to Ms. Spriggs' point about the interface that folks are having in their first experience sometimes. And so I think those are really tangible, concrete ways that you can make sure you're good to go. And then, certainly at places like the Legal Defense Fund and elsewhere, we have resources where if you're seeing or hear of things that are going wrong, to please reach out, which hopefully litigation is not needed and there are other ways to resolve that. But it's also recognizing that this is a big coalition of groups, that there are a lot of resources that are to share.
The legend, Dr. Franklin. Tell us a little bit, make us have a little hope. You have such a historical perspective, and it's very fascinating to me to see all the data, because I will say this, is that data, facts are important, and often they're overlooked. But if you have that concrete foundation, you can build a case. And that's often the most important element to build that case. So give us a little bit of hope. What can individuals do?
Well, no, I'm actually hopeful. I know it's dismal times. I'm hopeful because I look at the history, and it's with the indigenous infrastructures and talents and people, we can't be beaten. I mean, not forever, at least we can't be beaten. But I mean, I think I like to tell folks, you don't have to be like Moses and part the Red Sea. You don't have to move the mountain a mile. If you can just move it an inch, that's important. Things like making sure everyone in your church is registered to vote. Things like if people in your churches can't register to vote or can't vote because of incarceration records or previous histories, finding ways to address those issues. For about 6 years, I put students on doors, knocking on doors in a public housing development when I was working up in Murfreesboro, and the students loved it. I mean, we didn't have Vote Builder, Ban, or Catalyst. We didn't have any of that stuff, but they just wanted to get on doors and talk to residents. And what it does is that it gives them a certain form of political learning. And so as we mobilize our communities, we want to make sure that it's the intangibles that we're also giving people a chance to, not about necessarily all the time wins and losses, but about political learning. Latasha Brown has a statement that says that a lot of our communities don't want, is voting gonna essentially bring a revolution? Maybe not. Maybe so, but maybe not. But if it doesn't bring a revolution, it could definitely reduce harm. So it's also important to talk about the harm reduction strategies that voter turnout, voter mobilization can do. And that narrative is a way to help bring in people who are skeptical about voting. And what I'll say finally is that also giving a lot of attention to people who are disqualified from voting because of previous records. Several Senate races in the last number of years have turned because people in those states can't vote because of previous histories. Florida in 2000 looked differently. The country looked differently over the last 30 years if we had people who were disqualified from voting because of previous histories that they were able to vote. So finding ways to address that, supporting legal impact groups that are working on that, even on a case by case level, even on a court by court by court level is important. So there's a lot of things that we can do in our collective capacity and our indigenous infrastructures and talent will make it happen. But and I want to make this last point to go back to Ms. Spriggs's point with the work that she's doing with the coalitions, with the Divine Nine groups out there, with the NAACP out there, and other groups. We actually have across 95 counties in Tennessee, we actually have people on the ground in probably half the counties. Whether we can have solidarity, cohesion, and some type of kind of long-term plan to organize people, that's the question. That's the question.
Yes. Yes. And as I said, I could listen to this conversation all day. And I do see that there have been so many people to make very wonderful statements and comments in our chat. We don't have time to take those up. However, I will say this. I want us to leave with what I saw as a very profound statement. Leave no power on the table. We all have the power to make change. And that is one thing we are trying to do with these conversations at the YW. Many people look at these conversations after the fact, during the fact, and they'll reach out to us and say, what can I do more? And hopefully this mobilizes our community to be better, because at the end of the day, it's about each person taking that one step forward to make us the best community that we can be. And maybe one day we'll be viewed as a model for other communities around the country. So I want for our younger people to stay strong. I want our older people to stay strong too, because you know the lessons, you know what backsliding and what it will mean if we lose some of the things that we have gained over all these years, over the 60 years since the Voting Rights Act was passed. And we need to keep that moving forward. I thank from the bottom of my heart these panelists, especially you, Dr. Franklin. You're always there when we ask you to show up. We got to put a room at the YW for you, but you are always there because you're dedicated to our community, and that means so much to us. Thank you, Mr. Cusick. I know one of your co-workers at the Legal Defense Fund, Ariel Humphreys. I don't know whether you know her, but I'm her brother's godmother, so I guess she's still there. And also Ms. Spriggs, I know all your ride or dies at the Equity Alliance and love them all. So thank you so much for all the work that you do. And thank everyone for being part of this very important conversation.